We're of the school of thought that the music should come first in the sense that the ideas of what you want to sound like on a long tone or in a slur or in flexibility should come from a musical inspiration.
So I'm really excited and honored to have this opportunity to sit here with you and chat with you. As a child, my father used to have tapes in the car. The older ones of us know what that is, tapes. And he was listening to the CanadianBrass. So this ensemble was kind of with me all my life. So it's really great to have you here. And I would like to ask you, what does it mean to you to be part of such a great ensemble?
Well, we grew up with the tapes too, so so it's amazing. And actually, when I first joined the group, I think one of the coolest things was talking to the older members, not the founding members, but the ones that had been in the group for a long time. And they were all in agreement that that feeling of just being so excited to be part of a legacy like Canadian Brass, it doesn't go away, even after 10 years or 20 years. And so now this is my 10th year, and I have to say that the way you feel in a group for that long does change, but that feeling doesn't go away. It just feels like such a huge honor.
Yeah. Thank you for having us. Yeah, it's nice to meet you. The same. I grew up listening to Canadian Brass, and we have a responsibility to keep the legacy going and the traditions going. A group that's 50 years old almost has a lot of traditions and quite the following. So the audience expects certain things, aspects about the concerts and repertoire. And so I think we have a duty to continue that in addition to bring our own interests and musical loves to the group. And I think that helps the group to grow. So, yeah.
I was thinking when you joined the group, then you had to memorize a lot of sheet music because you're playing everything from memory on stage. How did you go about that? I mean, did you get a pile of sheet music and then had to study for a couple of months? What did you do?
Yeah, so the best story about that is the audition process, because we all have similar stories, but Chris and I went to Juilliard together. He was there for graduate studies when I was there for undergraduate studies. And this is only my 6th year in the group, so Chris has been in the group for how long? 10 years?
Yeah, I'm the second longest next to the founder.
Yeah,
believe it or not, somehow.
So we were friends at Juilliard. So Chris called me one day and asked to play duets at his house in New York City. And I went to his house and played for a couple hours, and then later I found out that was the audition. At least the first round. Round one.
Well,
yeah.
Well, I should interject here because that sounds too easy. The real round one was when we were students, and I wasn't even in Canadian Brass, and I never even thought that I would ever be in a position to hire anybody, let alone my own friends. But I remembered playing in my graduation recital and having some friends join me. But out of all of the people on the stage in this octet I put together, Caleb was the most prepared, maybe even more prepared than I was. And I took note of that, and he sounded amazing. And so when we were looking for somebody, naturally, the first person I thought was Caleb. And I told the guys, as long as he hasn't completely gone off the deep end and become a different person, he's probably the guy. Continue.
So after that first audition, which I didn't know was an audition, Chris called me and said that there was an opening in the ensemble and that the rest of the guys would like to play with me as an audition, second audition. And so he sent me a PDF file that, well, if you were to print it out, it would be this thick. And there was really no way to prepare all of that music in 4 days. But I did as much as I could. And then after that audition, which was hours and hours of playing through pieces, I was told to memorize 2 hours worth of music for the concert. And so I had to do that for my trial concert. So memorization is a big part of this.
That being said, though, I think that an important part of memorizing music, and this is worth for anyone listening that doesn't feel like they're as fluent at it yet, is that there's really not a line that is very clear between memorized and not memorized. And I think that's why it's often intimidating. People are like, well, how do you memorize all this music? But really, it just means you know it really well. And it's a spectrum. You learn it better and better and better, and eventually you memorize as a certain point. But it's not like you either have it memorized or not. You could get closer into that point. And really, it just means you know it by heart. And if you really know something by heart, for me, I always felt like if I was going to perform something on stage, I knew if I would be nervous or not. If the music was something that, without trying, I naturally just would sing to myself in the shower or in the elevator. If I wasn't just, without even thinking of it, it doesn't just come to my head and I was singing it, then that means I didn't really know that lick that really well. And so I never really thought of memorizing as something separate from just learning music. And I think that really helps.
He brought up singing. That's a big part of memorization. So I think we've noticed that the people that memorize music the quickest are the ones that have the best ears. And I would recommend to younger players, you should sing as much as you can.
Yeah.
And try singing the solos as you're learning them. If you're learning the Haydn concerto, sing through. And then work on also playing what you sing. So if you hear something on the radio or you hear a clarinet player in the orchestra practice something that sounds nice, sing it and then try to figure it out on your instrument.
Yeah.
And that helps your ear very, very much. And that also helps memorization.
I wonder if you could share some insights about how the five of you practice together. I mean, do you practice just the five of you, or do you have someone coaching you who is listening from the outside? How do you go about practicing together?
Yeah, we actually do both of those things. So we rehearse a lot together using the techniques actually that we were just describing when practicing with singing. We sing as a group together a lot. And actually, we started doing it more and more and more because we're just realizing how effective it is. But we also often will bring in somebody that we trust to listen, or we record ourselves and video ourselves, and we go through those recordings and tapes and make sure... Tapes, there we go, I said the word tape. What's tape? Anyway, we'll we'll video ourselves and just look and see if the spacing is right, if the music is blended, if things like that. So often you're your own best judge if you have a device that helps hold up that mirror. Mm-hmm.
Of course, it's the same when practicing for yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Recording is extremely useful feedback.
Yeah, and in an ensemble, it's important you're not only rehearsing how to play musically, you're also rehearsing how to interact socially and be respectful and communicate in a really clear but efficient and respectful way. And those same skills should be applied in your individual practicing. Oftentimes we talk to ourselves in a negative way when we're practicing. So if we can learn how to be very productive and never negative but always constructive, that's really, really helpful. It's a skill to develop.
Absolutely. Another thing is that a lot of groups are either one extreme or another, where they're either so critical of each other that they wind up fighting and breaking up, especially groups that have even number of players, because then they can have fights. But we have 5, so it's never a tie. Or there's groups that are so nice to each other that it's easy to stagnate. So there's this nice healthy balance where you're not afraid to tell your colleague that they could do better. And you're also not afraid to take that feedback. On the other hand, you're encouraging so that when you're on stage, you feel like you have support.
I mean, to play a concert on such a high level for 2 hours and everything from memory is a really outstanding accomplishment. My question is, how do you manage that? How do you keep yourself in shape? Do you have a special daily routine, or do you just play the music again and again? And actually, Chris, we were talking about your app, which a good friend of mine, Jürgen Kilian, developed, and he gave it to me actually to beta test it. And when I was experimenting with it, I thought, actually, that's not just a warm-up app, but it could also be used as a practice. What do you think about that?
device.
Yeah, actually, I think that you're right. I think that there's a blurry line between warm-up and practice. Really, when you think of a warm-up, warming up for the trumpet's more like warming up for golf, where it's mostly mental. You don't really have to do that much to physically warm up, although it's useful to be super consistent on that front. But if you look at the way golfers, by the way, I'm not a golfer, but if you look at the way golfers warm up, they start small so that they're thinking about putting in small distances, and they gradually expand. So they're using more and more muscles, but mostly they're thinking about longer and longer distances. So they're honing their focus. But you sort of get both of those things done at the same time with this sort of routine, because it starts easy enough that it is a physical and mental warm-up, but you're right, you could change the length of time and make it a real routine. Even if there are a lot of days when we're not on tour where my practice sessions are essentially that app's layout, but you can do it for 2 hours, and have a really concentrated, it's like going to the gym or something. So, but to answer your question, I think that there's a level of efficiency that you develop just because you kind of have to when you're playing such long, difficult concerts so many times in a row. I thought I was an efficient player when I joined Canadian Brass, but 10 years later, I just feel like I've redefined what being efficient really means. Like watching someone throw a ball, a real professional, it doesn't look like they're using all their strength, but it has so much power, and it's the same kind of idea.
Yeah. So efficiency is more important than strength.
Efficiency is probably the most important thing, because it winds up sounding better too. I think a good sound is an efficient sound.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. For me, I think a warm-up is finding your peak performance as quickly as possible in every category of trumpet playing.
Mm-hmm.
So finding the sound, finding the best balance of air, and articulation and response and flexibility and range, and with the least amount of effort. And then it can go into not just maintaining but also improving. And that's what we're talking about. A warm-up can become a maintenance routine. It can become a practice routine. But for me, a warm-up is really reaching your performance level as quickly as possible, especially when we have a concert every night, in this case for 14 nights in a row, before we get a break. So it's very important. I'm pretty structured with my warm-up routine, and lately I've been practicing with the timer, similar to the app. Otherwise I'll get stuck on one thing for too long. So I recommend it for a lot of younger players who either don't think that they have structure in their routine, or if they think that they are too
obsessive,
abstract, or if they we call it noodling around, right? Mm-hmm. So it's just kind of playing which is great. Actually, noodling. Sometimes I even put a noodle section in my warm-up routine. It's good to be creative in your warm-up.
Yeah. It's worth mentioning for all of you out there that Caleb is the best warm-upper out there.
No.
And this whole app idea came from when Caleb first joined the group. I heard all these beeps and tweets and all sorts of sounds coming from referee whistles,
whale songs.
Exactly, coming from his phone, and it turns out that he was basically timing these sections of what the app does. And so they stopped making that app, and so we decided to make something that had that structure, but it had more variability, so that you could, as simply as dragging a slider, for example, you could change the length.
So this is probably, you don't want to promote this other app other than
that's a great app too.
But this is a good app. It's called Seconds Pro, and this is what I'm using now on tour, and it's great. It's half an hour, and it goes through breathing and buzzing, and I even put my rest in, right? Long tones. I do some stamp, I do lip slurs, I do flexibility. Mm-hmm. Well, those are both the same, but kind of different. Articulation,
so really,
isolated
really
stacks.
Well structured and thought through.
Yeah, and it's nice, especially when you're so tired and you're on the road all day, and just to put on a timer and go through everything, and you know that everything's covered, and then you're ready to perform.
Ah, great. I have another question concerning the quality of practicing. You already mentioned that the quality is the most important thing. How do you practice? And I found a really great sentence that kind of summarizes this. One cannot not practice. So For example, in the morning when your alarm clock is ringing and you press snooze, and again snooze, and again, then you master the skill of not getting up in the morning. And if you try to expand your range on the trumpet and it's hard every time, and the air doesn't flow and your head is getting red and on, then that is actually what you're practicing. So the most of the time when you're playing, when you're practicing, you should practice what you actually already mastered. Do you see it like that?
Constantly building habits, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Sometimes
That's
they're
the
not
point.
good ones. Yeah, exactly. That's what you're saying.
Right.
Yeah.
They actually did a formal study on this with piano players that basically demonstrated that what matters, well, I'll tell you the study. They basically had a piece of music that none of the participants knew, and they were of all different levels, amateurs to professionals. But it was a piece that all levels can play to make sure that it wasn't like a piece that only the professionals could play, to rule out that. And they were given as much time as they wanted to practice. And the only rule was that once they were done practicing, they couldn't come back and do it later that day. But other than that, they were allowed to practice as long as they wanted. And the idea was to see if there was any correlation between practicing more and a better performance. And for the final performance, they let them perform it multiple times to rule out stage fright or anything like that. They wanted to make sure they really were performing at the level that they had practiced up to. And what they found was that there was zero correlation to how much time it took to learn a piece. But there was a correlation between something else, and it was what you're saying. It was the ratio between how many times they played it correctly and the ratio between that and how many times they played it incorrectly. So like you're saying, everything you do, your brain remembers with equal importance, whether it was good or bad. And you want that ratio to be as high in the good and as low in the bad as possible. So there are certain skills that require you push that boundary. For example, I don't know if you want to only play slow if you're trying to increase your speed. But that being said, you want to make sure that the quality, the ratio of quality sounding things and easy feeling things is higher than...
Yeah, that's great advice.
Yeah. Performers, there's often a big discrepancy between full-time performers and really, really good students. And even people that are full-time performers would probably notice that, like, even when they were really good students, there's a sudden leap that happens when you're performing full-time. And I think it's a really simple explanation, is that you're suddenly, because you're in public more often, a bigger percentage of your life, you're held to a higher standard. And it's the easiest way to simulate that when you are a student or somebody that's not performing very often is to force yourself to, one day a week, for instance, post a video on YouTube or send it to all of your closest friends and relatives. And you're gonna have a different standard than if you're simply performing for yourself.
That's a great tip.
Yeah.
Or just grab the person in the next practice room and ask them.
Right.
So, I teach at University of North Texas, and Chris teaches at Ithaca College. And I tell my students that, well, they come into lessons a lot and they say, oh, I swear this went better in the practice room.
Exactly.
It's like the number one comment that we get from students. I swear it was better in the practice room. I promise.
I worked
Like,
so hard.
yeah, and we always say, yeah, I'm sure it was very consistent. But oftentimes when we practice, we stop at the mistake and then we practice them where the mistake happened and we keep going. But we have to do it in context. And also that helps stage fright. This is all related to anxiety on stage and confidence. And if you practice performing a piece all the way through more often, then you're holding yourself to that higher standard. And that's really, really important.
I mean, without saying too much on the issue, I think it's worth mentioning that I guess there's two schools of thoughts here, but I think we're of the school of thought that the music should come first in the sense that the ideas of what you want to sound like on a long tone or in a slur or in flexibility should come from a musical inspiration. And I think that there are some schools of thought that make sense on the surface, like, no, you should master every articulation and then you can play anything. And I don't think that that's realistic because your creativity is limited to your experiences. And when you hear a cello player play a piece that you've never heard on a level you never dreamed was possible, and you hear articulations from another instrument, and then you say, well, I want to do that on the trumpet, and then you put that into your routine and try to copy that sound. That's much more specific than being able to do long, short, and in between.
I also notice the people that practice kind of mechanically some of them like second study or something.
Right.
Then sound also mechanically when they should play music.
Right. So we like to recommend that any technique that a trumpet player is working on, whether it's articulation or range or volume or high range, anything, or a solo, always try to have a specific recording in your head to reference when you're going for that articulation. So when we're playing a Bach piece, we'll listen to Fabio Biondi on violin, his articulation,
amazing.
you know.
Articulation.
Or sometimes when I'm playing piccolo trumpet, I like to think of Emmanuel Paoud on flute, Berlin Philharmonic, and the way he articulates, you know. And it's through, if you're warming up, or if you're playing at all without a very clear idea of how you want to sound,
you'll get worse.
then you won't improve. Well, you won't improve as quick.
Yeah.
And you won't be as good of a musician as you could be.
Yeah.
So when you go on stage, most of us get nervous to some extent, and you could interpret that as a response of your system to this stage situation. So you're actually getting more energy, you're getting adrenaline, you're concentrated, you're more focused, and then most of us have the tendency to not wanting to have it, to be calm and cool and relaxed. But these two things kind of contradicts each other. To have this energy and then not wanting it. So how do you go about this situation?
I think that there's a lot of things going on here. Most of the reasons that people have this conflict about whether that energy is good or bad is because I think there's different reasons and different emotions that we put into one thing called stage fright or nervousness. And the reality is there's three different things you could feel. One could be that you're not prepared. And you're not really feeling nervous, you're feeling insecure. And insecure is totally different, but it's easy to confuse. And that there's only one way to fix that, that's to prepare or to not care. So in the situation, probably the only thing you can do is not care and you'll probably do better. But in preparation, you want to think ahead and know that you'll feel that way and avoid it by preparing. The other thing is that we often prepare at a quality that might be here, but when you're on stage, suddenly you're remembering all the great performances you've ever seen, and you're expecting or wishing for this. And that gap between what you actually probably will do and what you really want to do is what makes you feel nervous. So if you prepare for this and also expect something that's realistic, which is not going to be perfect, you're going to have less nerves as well. And of course, experience is a huge part of it. Most of us don't perform that often, and if 90% of your instrument time is in a practice room by yourself, you're just going to feel uncomfortable when you're in a new situation. Christopher Hadfield is an astronaut that has a whole series of classes, and he also talks about it in a TED Talk that when they poll how many people are afraid of spiders, I think he's Canadian, so they asked Canadians. The amount was something like 95% of people are afraid of spiders. But when you look at all the spiders that exist, there's 30,000 species, and a small sliver of that are poisonous. And because Canada's cold, only a fraction of a percent of those even exist there, and they're really easy to spot. They're black widows. They have a big red thing on them. And yet most people, when they walk into a spider web, freak out, and So he says that as an astronaut, and this is the same for a performer of music or anything, is they basically do the equivalent of you walk into a spider web and you freak out, and then you walk into another one and you freak out. And by the time you've walked into 1,000 spider webs, you don't freak out. And that's an important part of the training. It's just getting yourself in front of people, getting used to that feeling, learning to love the adrenaline, and learning to prepare to not feel the insecurity.
Yeah, I think a lot of this depends on where your priorities are as a musician. Because if you think about it, when someone asks, "Are you ready for this performance?" What are they really asking? Are they asking about in terms of accuracy, in terms of learning the notes, where does your mind go when someone asks you that? For me, it used to be that, and more, it's becoming more and more about do I have a story to tell the audience? And I think once you prioritize that, it completely takes the spotlight, well, not completely, but it moves the spotlight from you to the music. And then you're serving your audience instead of serving yourself. And I think what Chris is talking about, not caring, I think it's more about not caring about accuracy and caring more about telling a story and being very, very clear with that. So, but we practice that every day when we pick up our trumpet. So even when you're playing at home, if your only mindset in practicing is accuracy and technique for technique's sake, then when you get on stage, that's going to be your mindset. You're gonna be listening for those things. However, if you're always trying to achieve that sound that's in your ear, and by sound I mean complete concept, not just the tone, but the sound of the what you want to sound like and who you want to sound like, and what you want to say with every phrase. I notice the more I get nervous, the more I consciously try to put the focus on the music and less on myself. Because if you identify as a trumpet player and if you put your identity in the trumpet and not as someone just trying to sing a song through the instrument, then you get nervous very quickly. Because a lot of things can go wrong on this piece of brass.
Yeah. Amen. Yeah, it's worth mentioning technology is, we've mentioned recording, is one really useful way to prepare for any events. And since stage fright is something that's on any performer's mind, we're working on incorporating virtual reality, so into not just the practice app and the warm-up app, but into a way that you could practice in any situation you want, whether that's in a peaceful place in nature, so that's something that your brain will remember and bring onto the stage, or a stage, so you could practice standing on stage with a virtual audience, so you're not as surprised when you're standing and you feel that experience. So keep an eye out for that, and our mutual friend will be the one making it. So you'll probably hear about it first.
So it's an amazing idea.
It's going to be cool. We already have it. The beta testing is already on our phones. So
talking about mindset, the tool I use for mindset is Alexander technique, which brings me actually in the here and now. So my body gets more relaxed, my mind is more flexible, my breathing gets freer, and well, there are a lot of different techniques, whether it's NLP or mindfulness or yoga. And do you use some kind of tool in terms of mindset, or is it just this, I think about music, I want to give something to the audience, I want to tell a story, I want to invite the audience to be with me, to be with us and have a nice event together. So how do you go about mindset?
yeah, that's a good question. I think it's impossible to separate your personal life and how you go through your existence from your music. So I think it's, I don't know, at least for me, it's hard to pinpoint one technique that it's, but for instance, I have found that meditation is very useful. I'm not as consistent with it as I'd like to, but it is a tool that I found very useful. But I feel like being present in just things you do, sweeping the floor, will translate into being present when you play. And like Caleb was saying about practicing and stage fright, if you're really present when you practice and not just playing mindlessly, you won't be suddenly shocked when an audience snaps you out of it and you're suddenly like, your presence, that feeling of being present and on stage doesn't feel bad. It feels good because you're used to feeling present. A lot of times we go through life spaced out or completely distracted, moving faster than we could even think, or thinking faster than we can move. And being on stage forces you into reality like that. And if you're used to that, then it feels amazing. And if you're not used to that, it feels like you're naked in public. It's terrible.
Yeah. For me, it's directly related to my faith. I'm a Christian, so everything I do on the trumpet, I try to do for the glory of God. And I've realized that the more spotlight I put on myself in terms of my identities and trumpet, the more the chances I have of failing myself, right? So it's very common for musicians to put their identity in their instrument and to be defined as a trumpet player. And And for me, I put it in God. So that's you can't really separate it from me.
Okay, so thank you very much for this interview. I really learned a lot, and I am sure that our audience will benefit from it. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you.